evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems. The ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Before we get on with the show, I'd like to take a couple of minutes of your time and ask for a little bit of support. The show is brought to you by supporters on Patreon. I'm hearing from people all the time how valuable they find the show, and those supporters who have the means to help fund it, to keep it going, and to help me reach new audiences are very much appreciated. I also have to be completely honest with you at the moment. I work in the hospitality industry and we've been hit very hard by the pandemic. I'm on short time at the moment and stressing quite a lot about money, so I'd appreciate support to help make ends meet, and ultimately I really would love to start doing this full time. I'd like to be free of working for others, and I'd love to take Sleepy Time Tales to the next level, doing more episodes, take more time on story selection, and write more original stuff that I just don't have the time to do right now. So if you're making use of Sleepy Time Tales regularly to help you to deal with sleeplessness, and you have the urge to support the show, and of course, most importantly, if you have the means, because times are tough for everybody, please check out patreon.com/sleepytimetales or take a look at the link in the show notes or from the website. You'll have the satisfaction of knowing that you're contributing to the rest and lifestyle improvements of thousands of people, as well as helping me out a little bit. And over and above that, there are real rewards from as little as $2 a month. From early release of the main episode to weekly bonus episodes and special edits of the main show. Also, if you don't want to sign up for something monthly, there is a new service that I've signed up for recently called Buy Me a Coffee. So if you'd like to make a once-off contribution without having to sign up on your own for any new accounts or anything, just go to buymeacoffee.com/sleepytimetales and buy me a coffee. It'll be much appreciated. There's also a button on the website and a link in the show notes to go and to take a look. And also recently, actually quite a while ago, I got a suggestion to do personal stories for people. So I thought I'd give it a try. I don't think many people would go for it, but if you are interested, if there's a personal story of yours that you would like me to read to you, or if you think someone would appreciate the gift of a personal favorite story that they would like to listen to at bedtime, just drop me a mail at contact@sleepytimetales.net, and I will give you a very good price, because thanks to exchange rates, dollars and pounds go quite far here. So I can give you a very good price that works out very well for me. Also, because these are strictly for personal use, they can be anything that you want. It doesn't have to be pre-1924 or anything like that. So, yeah, as long as you legitimately own it, drop me a line and I can set something up for you. Again, that's at contact@sleepytimetales.net. But while money is good, of course, that helps you buy food and pay rent and stuff, another huge way to help the show is just to spread the word. If there is someone in your life who you think will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, just let them know. If you recommend the show on social media, make sure to tag me in so that I know and I can thank you. That's at Sleepy Time Tales on Instagram or Twitter. Speaking of which, I did get a shout out quite recently from Carolyn, who recommended me on Twitter. Thanks for the shout out, Carolyn. Thanks for the recommendation. And I'm very glad that the show helps for you and you're recommending it to others. And last but not least, of course, I need to give props to the music. The song that I've been using now, this is now our second episode with it, is Sweet Night and Friends by Komiko. Their music is available on their website at loyaltyfreakmusic.com, which you'll find at the link in the show notes, because they've got a lot of very cool stuff under various names that I recommend checking out. This has definitely gone on long enough. Thank you for taking the time, and let's get back to the show. So, what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for? The strange idea this odd podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to. But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, with your mind spinning in emotions and turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Now, if you're a new listener, I need to explain a little bit about this show. Every episode starts with this long intro, which usually goes on for about 15 minutes. It serves a couple of very important purposes, but it's the one thing that a lot of people sometimes struggle a little bit to get to grips with. The first purpose for it is I need to explain the structure of the show to new listeners and kind of make a case for it to why I think it's going to be helpful for you. And for people who've been listening to the show for a while, it has a very important purpose as well. Because it's basically the same every time with a few little changes, it's something familiar to sort of have in the background while you're starting to settle down. This is the chance where if you feel like it, grab a drink of water, go brush your teeth, have me droning on, telling the same sort of thing over and over again in the background. Fluff up your pillows, settle down into your bed, make sure your environment's warm but not too warm, and snuggle down and get ready for sleep. Because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to build a space together. And one of those things that helps is the familiarity of this long intro that goes on. But for people that are new to the show, to sort of explain it to you, the Sleepy Time Tales is intended to be used as a sort of background noise, or maybe company, or sometimes just a distraction to what keeps you awake at night. Often insomnia and sleeplessness come from stress and niggles of waking life, things that poke away at our brain as the night gets dark and we try to settle down to sleep. And I'm here to help distract that in some small way. Different people find different things helpful, and sometimes for different reasons. The primary aim with this podcast is that I'm here to distract you, to share a story boringly told that keeps the doubts and stresses at bay long enough for sleep to come for you. Now, as far as I'm aware of, there's a couple of different ways to engage with the show. If you're someone like me who has stresses and anxieties that keep you awake at night, I need something to focus on, a story or an event that lets me keep my mind on something specific, to stop it from spinning out into those stresses and anxieties. I need to focus just enough not to resist the embrace of a night's sleep when it comes for me. There may be a second way for some people. Maybe you just need a background noise, some droning noise. Some people maybe need the sound of the ocean or the wind in the trees, or maybe just some boring dude droning on. Tonight's story is a complete short story from G.K. Chesterton. It's The Vanishing Prince from the compilation The Man Who Knew Too Much. It does get a little bit action-packed and there are some fatalities in it, but I'm pretty sure that the way I tell it means you won't be too engrossed in the outcome to stay awake. But as I tell you the story, whatever it is, whether it's boring or sometimes maybe a little bit more action-packed than expected, it's important that you don't force sleep. Just keep a light mental grip on the story as I'm telling it, and allow the need for sleep to come for you. Now, obviously, I'm hoping that you're asleep long before we get to the end of the episode, but it is very important that you don't feel pressurized. I'm sure many of us have had those nights where you're so desperate to fall asleep and you get more wound up and more tense, and we all know that doesn't help. It's very possible, especially if this is your first night, it won't work for you. In fact, the odds are pretty good it probably won't. I suggest you take a few nights, maybe about 3, to see if you start getting used to listening to my voice or my accent, or just the strangeness of the idea of trusting some strange guy to talk to you in your sleep. It's also possible that for some people, one episode isn't long enough. And there's a different kind of insomnia as well, the kind where you wake up in the middle of the night. That's actually my one more recently. I wake up at 3 a.m. and sort of not even quite sure that I am awake, and I end up lying awake half the night. So what I do with my sleep podcast is I queue up a whole bunch. I usually start with the latest episode, and then I have enough available to run through the whole night. And then I hit play, and then when I wake up in the middle of the night, I just pop my earbuds back in, and there I go, straight back to sleep again. Another one lately is I actually sometimes wake up 30 minutes or 60 minutes before my alarm goes. What I do is I do the exact same thing as if it was 3 a.m. Even if the sun is peeking through the curtains, I pop my earbuds back in, carry on listening, and usually I'm right back to sleep again. And it may seem strange, but I got to tell you that sometimes that 30 minutes or 60 minutes is the most deeply restful part of my night. There is something about relaxing right before the alarm that is just satisfying on a whole new level. But it's very important as I'm talking to you that you just try to relax. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this probably will seem strange to you. So please just give it a chance. So that's the idea. You relax and you lie in the dark, and while you do that, I'll tell you a tale. So relax, dear listener, my nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark, listening to my voice. You will always be safe with me, because I'm here to help you relax, to improve your life in a small way, or maybe not so small. People don't sleep very well these days, and it makes their lives harder. So I'm here to do my small part to help you in a big way, to help you to face tomorrow and the day after well rested and better able to cope and process. I believe very strongly in the benefits of kindness. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. I need you to be kind to yourself. Because if you beat yourself up or rebuke yourself over not sleeping, there's nothing that I can do to help you. Don't get tense if you just can't get over the edge of sleep, even with me here in your ears trying to help. Because I'm sure we're all familiar with the fact that frustration is a huge enemy of a good night's sleep. And the intention with this podcast is to short-circuit that frustration, to distract the feeling we get when we blame ourselves for not being able to let go and drift into the dark. So take a breath. Forgive the fact that you can't sleep and let my voice wash over you. Take another breath. Imagine the warm darkness rising up, inviting you to sleep and to a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself and we'll try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, sleep is something like an enemy. But it is not your enemy. It's a natural process that we've been pulled away from by stress and life, and supposed progress that shines bright lights in our eyes at all hours. But I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. From The Man Who Knew Too Much by G.K. Chesterton. The Vanishing Prince. This tale begins among a tangle of tales round a name that is at once recent and legendary. The name is that of Michael O'Neill, popularly called Prince Michael, partly because he claimed descent from ancient Fenian princes, and partly because he was credited with a plan to make himself Prince President of Ireland, as the last Napoleon did of France. He was undoubtedly a gentleman of honourable pedigree and of many accomplishments, but two of his accomplishments emerged from all the rest. He had a talent for appearing when he was not wanted, and a talent for disappearing when he was wanted, especially when he was wanted by the police. It may be added that his disappearances were more dangerous than his appearances. In the latter, he seldom went beyond the sensational, pasting up seditious placards, tearing down official placards, making flamboyant speeches or unfurling forbidden flags. But in order to effect the former, he would sometimes fight for his freedom with startling energy, from which men were sometimes lucky to escape with a broken head instead of a broken neck. His most famous feats of escape, however, were due to dexterity and not to violence. On a cloudless summer morning, he had come down a country road white with dust, and, pausing outside a farmhouse, had told the farmer's daughter, with elegant indifference, that the local police were in pursuit of him. The girl's name was Bridget Royce, a somber and even sullen type of beauty, and she looked at him darkly, as if in doubt, and said, "Do you want me to hide you?" Upon which he only laughed, leapt lightly over the stone wall, and strode towards the farm, merely throwing over his shoulder the remark, "Thank you. I've generally been quite capable of hiding myself." In which proceeding he acted with a tragic ignorance of the nature of women, and there fell on his path in that sunshine a shadow of doom. While he disappeared through the farmhouse, the girl remained for a few moments looking up the road, and 2 perspiring policemen came ploughing up to the door where she stood. Though still angry, she was still silent, and a quarter of an hour later the officers had searched the house, and were already inspecting the kitchen garden and cornfield behind it. In the ugly reaction of her mood, she might have been tempted even to point out the fugitive, but for a small difficulty that she had no more notion than the policeman had of where he could possibly have gone. The kitchen garden was enclosed by a very low wall, and the cornfield beyond lay aslant like a square patch on a great green hill, on which he could still have been seen even as a dot in the distance. Everything stood solid in its familiar place. The apple tree was too small to support or hide a climber. The only shed stood open and obviously empty. There was no sound save the droning of summer flies and the occasional flutter of a bird, unfamiliar enough to be surprised by the scarecrow in the field. There was scarcely a shadow save a few blue lines that fell from the thin tree. Every detail was picked out by the brilliant light day as if in a microscope. The girl described the scene later with all the passionate realism of her race, and whether or no the policeman had a similar eye for the picturesque, they had at least an eye for the facts of the case, and were compelled to give up the chase and retire from the scene. Bridget Royce remained as if in a trance, staring at the sunlit garden in which a man had just vanished like a fairy. She was still in a sinister mood, and the miracle took in her mind a character of unfriendliness and fear, as if the fairy were decidedly a bad fairy. The sun upon the glittering garden depressed her more than the darkness, but she continued to stare at it. Then the world itself went half-witted and she screamed. The scarecrow moved in the sunlight. It had stood with its back to her in a tattered old black hat and a tattered garment, and with all its tatters flying, it strode away across the hill. She did not analyze the audacious trick by which the man had turned to his advantage the subtle effects of the expected and the obvious. She was still under the cloud of more individual complexities, and she noticed most of all that the vanishing scarecrow did not even turn to look at the farm. And the fates that were running so adverse to his fantastic career of freedom ruled that his next adventure, though it had the same success in another quarter, should increase the danger in this quarter. Among the many similar adventures related of him in this manner, it is also said that some days afterwards another girl named Mary Regan found him concealed on the farm where she worked, and if the story is true, she must also have had the shock of the uncanny experience. When she was busy at some lonely task in the yard, she heard a voice speaking out of the well, and found that the eccentric had managed to drop himself into the bucket, which was some little way below, the well only partly full of water. In this case, however, he had to appeal to the woman to wind up the rope, and men say it was when this news was told to the other woman that her soul walked over the borderline of treason. Such at least were told the stories of him in the countryside, and there were many more. as that he had stood insolently in a splendid green dressing gown on the steps of a great hotel, and then led the police a chase through the long suite of grand apartments, and finally through his own bedroom onto a balcony that overhung the river. The moment the pursuers stepped onto the balcony, it broke under them, and they dropped pell-mell into the eddying waters, while Michael, who had thrown off his gown and dived, was able to swim away. It was said that he had carefully cut away the props so that they would not support anything so heavy as a policeman. But here again he was immediately fortunate, yet ultimately unfortunate, for it is said that one of the men was drowned, leaving a family feud which made a little rift in his popularity. These stories can now be told in some detail, not because they are the most marvelous of his many adventures, but because these alone were not covered with silence but the loyalty of the peasantry. These alone found their way into official reports, and it is these which three of the chief officials of the country were reading and discussing when the more remarkable part of the story begins. Night was far advanced, and the lights shone in the cottage that served for a temporary police station near the coast. On one side of it were the last houses of the straggling village, and on the other nothing but a waste moorland, stretching away towards the sea, the line of which was broken by no landmark except a solitary tower of the prehistoric pattern still found in Ireland, standing up as slender as a column but pointed like a pyramid. At a wooden table in front of the window, which normally looked out on this landscape, sat two men in plain clothes, but with something of a military bearing, for indeed they were the two chiefs of the detective service of that district. The senior of the two, both in age and rank, was a sturdy man with a short white beard, and frosty eyebrows fixed in a frown which suggested rather worry than severity. His name was Morton, and he was a Liverpool man, long pickled in the Irish quarrels, and doing his duty among them in a sour fashion, not altogether unsympathetic. He had spoken a few sentences to his companion, Nolan, a tall dark man with a cadaverous equine Irish face, when he seemed to remember something and touched a bell which rang in another room. The subordinate he had summoned immediately appeared with a sheaf of papers in his hands. "Sit down, Wilson," he said. "These are the depositions, I suppose." "Yes," replied the third officer. "I think I've got all there is to be got out of them, so I sent the people away." "Did Mary Cregan give evidence?" asked Morton, with a frown that looked a little heavier than usual. "No, but her master did," answered the man called Wilson, who had flat red hair and a plain pale face, not without sharpness. "I think he's hanging around the girl himself and is out against a rival. There's always some reason of that sort when we are told the truth about anything, and you bet the other girl got told right enough." "Well, let's hope they will be of some sort of use," remarked Nolan in a somewhat hopeless manner, gazing out into the darkness. "Anything is to the good," said Morton. "That lets us know anything about him." "Do we know anything about him?" asked the melancholy Irishman. "We know one thing about him," said Wilson, "and it's the one thing that nobody ever knew before. We know where he is." "Are you sure?" inquired Morton, looking at him sharply. "Quite sure," replied his assistant. "At this very minute he is in that tower over there by the shore. If you go near enough, you'll see the candle burning in the window." As he spoke, the noise of a horn sounded on the road outside, and a moment after they heard the throbbing of a motor car brought to a standstill before the door. Morton instantly sprang to his feet. "Thank the Lord that's the car from Dublin," he said. "I can't do anything without special authority. Not if he was sitting on the top of the tower and putting his tongue out at us. But the chief can do what he thinks best." He hurried out to the entrance and was soon exchanging greetings with a big handsome man in a fur coat, who brought into the dingy little station the indescribable glow of the great cities and the luxuries of the great world. For this was Sir Walter Carey, an official of such eminence in Dublin Castle that nothing short of the case of Prince Michael would have brought him on such a journey in the middle of the night. But the case of Prince Michael, as it happened, was complicated by legalism as well as lawlessness. On the last occasion he had escaped by a forensic quibble and not, as usual, by private escapade. It was a question whether at the moment he was amenable to the law or not. It might be necessary to stretch a point, but a man like Sir Walter could probably stretch it as far as he liked. Whether he intended to do so was a question to be considered. Despite the almost aggressive touch of luxury in the fur coat, it soon became apparent that Sir Walter's large leonine head was for use as well as ornament, and he considered the matter soberly and sanely enough. 5 chairs were set round the plain deal table, for who should Sir Walter bring with him but his young relative and secretary, Horne Fisher? Sir Walter listened with grave attention, and his secretary with polite boredom, to the string of episodes by which the police had traced the flying rebel from the steps of the hotel to the solitary tower beside the sea. There at least he was cornered between the moors and the breakers, and the scout sent by Wilson reported him as writing under a solitary candle, perhaps composing another of his tremendous proclamations. Indeed, it would have been typical of him to choose it as the place in which to finally turn to bay. He had some remote claim on it, as on a family castle, and those who knew him thought him capable of imitating the primitive Irish chieftains who fell fighting against the sea. "I saw some queer-looking people leaving as I came in," said Sir Walter Carey. "I suppose they were your witnesses. But why do they turn up here at this time of night?" Morton smiled grimly. "They come here by night because they would be dead men if they came here by day. They are criminals committing a crime that is more horrible here than theft or murder." "What crime do you mean?" asked the other with some curiosity. "They are helping the law," said Morton. There was a silence, and Sir Walter considered the papers before him with an abstracted eye. At last he spoke. "Quite so, but look here. If the local feeling is as lively as that, there are a good many points to consider. I believe the new Act will enable me to collar him now if I think it's best. But is it best? A serious rising would do us no good in Parliament, and the government has enemies in England as well as Ireland. It won't do if I have done what looks a little sharp practice and then only raised a revolution." "It's all the other way," said the man named Wilson, rather quickly. "There won't be half so much of a revolution if you arrest him as there will be if you leave him loose for 3 days longer. But anyhow, there can't be anything nowadays that the proper police can't manage." "Mr. Wilson is a Londoner," said the Irish detective with a smile. "Yes, I'm a Cockney all right," replied Wilson, "and I think I'm all the better for that, especially at this job, oddly enough." Sir Walter seemed slightly amused at the pertinacity of the third officer, and perhaps even more amused at the slight accent with which he spoke, which rendered rather needless his boast about his origin. "Do you mean to say," he asked, "that you know more about the business here because you have come from London?" "Sounds funny, I know, but I do believe it," answered Wilson. "I believe these affairs want fresh methods. But most of all, I believe they want a fresh eye." The superior officers laughed, and the red-haired man went on with a slight touch of temper. "Well, look at the facts. See how the fellow got away every time, and you'll underscore what I mean. Why was he able to stand in the place of the scarecrow, hidden by nothing but an old hat? Because it was a village policeman who knew the scarecrow was there, was expecting it, and therefore took no notice of it. Now, I never expect a scarecrow. I've never seen one in the street, and I stare at one when I see it in the field. It's a new thing to me and worth noticing. It was just the same when he hid in the well. You're ready to find a well in a place like that. You look for a well, and so you don't see it. I don't look for it, and therefore I do look at it. It is certainly an idea, said Sir Walter, smiling. But what about the balcony? Balconies are occasionally seen in London. But not rivers right under them as if it was in Venice, replied Wilson. It is certainly a new idea, repeated Sir Walter, with something like respect. He had all the love of the luxurious classes for new ideas, but he also had a critical faculty and was inclined to think, after due reflection, that it was a true idea as well. Growing dawn had already turned the window panes from black to grey when Sir Walter got abruptly to his feet. The others rose also, taking this for a signal that their rest was to be undertaken. But the leader stood for a moment in deep thought, as if conscious that he had come to a parting of the ways. Suddenly the silence was pierced by a long wailing cry from the dark moors outside. The silence that followed it seemed more startling than the shriek itself, and it lasted until Nolan said heavily, "'Tis the banshee. Somebody is marked for the grave." His long, large-featured face was as pale as a moon, and it was easy to remember he was the only Irishman in the room. "Well, I know that banshee," said Wilson cheerfully, "ignorant as you think I am of these things. I talked to that banshee myself an hour ago, and I sent that banshee up to the tower and told her to sing out like that if she could get a glimpse of our friend writing his proclamation." "Do you mean that girl Bridget Royce?" asked Morton, drawing his frosty brows together. "Has she turned King's evidence to that extent?" "Yes," answered Wilson. "I know very little of these local things you tell me, but I reckon an angry woman is much the same in all countries." Nolan, however, seemed still moody and unlike himself. "It's an ugly noise and an ugly business altogether," he said. "If it's really the end of Prince Michael, it may well be the end of other things as well. When the spirit is on him, he could escape by the ladder of dead men and wade through that sea as if it were made of blood." "Is that the real reason of your pious alarms?" asked Wilson, with a slight sneer. The Irishman's pale face blackened with a new passion. "I have faced as many murders in County Clare as you ever fought with in Clapham Junction, Mr. Cockney," he said. "Hush, please," said Morton sharply. "Wilson, you have no kind of right to implied doubt of your superior's conduct. I hope you'll prove yourself as courageous and trustworthy as he has always been." The pale face of the red-haired man seemed a shade paler, but he was silent and composed, and Sir Walter went up to Nolan with marked courtesy, saying, "Shall we go outside now and get this business done?" Dawn had lifted, leaving a white chasm of white between a great grey cloud and great grey moorland, beyond which the tower was outlined against the daybreak and the sea. Something in its plain and primitive shape vaguely suggested the dawn in its first days of the earth, in some prehistoric time when even the colours were hardly created, when there was only blank daylight between cloud and clay. These dead hues were relieved only by one spot of gold, the spark of the candle alight in the window of the lonely tower and burning on to the broadening daylight. As the group of detectives, followed by a cordon of policemen, spread out into a crescent to cut off all escape, the light in the tower flashed as if it were moved for a moment, and then went out. They knew the man inside had realized the daylight and blown out his candle. "There are other windows, aren't there?" asked Morton. "And a door, of course, somewhere around the corner. Only a round tower has no corners." "Another example of my small suggestion," observed Wilson quietly. "That queer tower was the first thing I saw when I came to these parts, and I can tell you a little more about it, or at any rate, the outside of it. There are 4 windows altogether, one a little way from this one, but just as out of sight. Those are both on the ground floor, and so is the third on the other side, making a sort of triangle. But the fourth is just above the third, and I suppose it looks on an upper floor." "It's only a sort of loft, reached by a ladder," said Nolan. "I played in the place when I was a child. It's no more than an empty shell." And his sad face grew sadder, thinking perhaps of the tragedy of his country and the part that he played in it. "The man must have got a table and chair at any rate," said Wilson, "but no doubt he could have got those from some cottage. If I might make a suggestion, sir, I think we ought to approach all the 5 entrances at once, so to speak. One of us should go to the door and one to each window. McBride here has a ladder for the upper window." Mr. Horn Fisher languidly turned to his distinguished relative and spoke for the first time. "I am rather a convert to the Cockney School of Psychology," he said in an almost inaudible voice. The others seemed to feel the same influence in different ways, for the group began to break up in the manner indicated. Morton moved toward the window immediately in front of them, where the hidden outlaw had just snuffed the candle. Nolan a little further westward to the next window, while Wilson, followed by McBride with the ladder, went round to the 2 windows at the back. Sir Walter Carey himself, followed by his secretary, began to walk round toward the only door, to demand admittance in more regular fashion. "He will be armed, of course," remarked Sir Walter casually. "By all accounts," replied Horn Fisher, "he can do more with a candlestick than most men with a pistol, but he's pretty sure to have the pistol too." Even as he spoke, the question was answered with a tongue of thunder. Morton had just placed himself in front of the nearest window, his broad shoulders blocking the aperture. For an instant it was lit from within as with red fire, followed by a thundering throng of echoes. The square shoulders seemed to alter in shape, and the sturdy figure collapsed among the tall rank grasses at the foot of the tower. A puff of smoke floated from the window like a little cloud. The 2 men behind rushed to the spot and raised him, but he was dead. Sir Walter straightened himself and called out something that was lost in another noise of firing. It was possible that the police were already avenging their comrade from the other side. Fisher had already raced around to the next window, and a new cry of astonishment from him brought his patron to the same spot. Nolan, the Irish policeman, had also fallen, sprawling all his great length in the grass, and it was red with his blood. He was still alive when they reached him, but there was death on his face, and he was only able to make a final gesture, telling them that all was over, and with a broken word and heroic effort, motioning them on to where his other comrades were besieging the back of the tower. Stunned by these rapid and repeated shocks, the 2 men could only vaguely obey the gesture, and finding their way to the other windows at the back, they discovered a scene equally startling, if less final and tragic. The other 2 officers were not dead or mortally wounded, but McBride lay with a broken leg, and his ladder was on top of him, evidently thrown down from the top window of the tower, while Wilson lay on his face, quite still as if stunned, with his red head among the grey and silver of the sea holly. In him, however, the impotence was but momentary, for he began to move and rise as the others came around the tower. "Oh my God, it's like an explosion," cried Sir Walter, and indeed it was the only word for this unearthly energy, by which one man had been able to deal death or destruction on 3 sides of the same small triangle at the same instant. Wilson had already scrambled to his feet, and with splendid energy flew again at the window, revolver in hand. He fired twice into the opening and then disappeared in his own smoke, but the thud of his feet and the shock of the falling chair told him that the intrepid Londoner had managed at last to leap into the room. There followed a curious silence, and Sir Walter, walking to the window through the thinning smoke, looked into the hollow shell of the ancient tower. Except for Wilson staring around him, there was nobody there. The inside of the tower was a single empty room with nothing but a plain wooden chair and a table on which were pens, ink, and paper, and the candlestick. Halfway up the high wall there was a rude timber platform under the open window, a small loft which was more like a large shelf. It was reached only by a ladder, and it seemed to be as bare as the bare walls. Wilson completed his survey of the place and then went and stared at the things on the table. Then he silently pointed with his lean forefinger at the open page of the large notebook. The writer had suddenly stopped writing, even in the middle of a word. I said it was like an explosion, said Sir Walter Carey at last, and really the man seems to have suddenly exploded, but he's blown himself up somehow without touching the tower. He's burst more like a bubble than a bomb. He has touched more valuable things than the tower, said Wilson gloomily. There was a long silence, and then Sir Walter said seriously, "Well, Mr. Wilson, I'm not a detective, and these unhappy happenings have left you in charge of that branch of the business. We all lament the cause of this, but I should like to say that I myself have the strongest confidence in your capacity for carrying on the work. What do you think we should do next?" Wilson seemed to rouse himself from his depression and acknowledged the speaker's words with a warmer civility than he had hitherto shown to anybody. He called in a few of the police to assist in rooting out the interior, leaving the rest to spread themselves in a search party outside. "I think," he said, "the first thing is to make quite sure about the inside of this place, as it was hardly physically possible for him to have got outside. I suppose poor Nolan would have brought in his banshee and said it was supernaturally possible, but I've got no use for disembodied spirits when I'm dealing with facts. And the facts before me are an empty tower with a ladder, a chair, and a table." "The spiritualist," said Sir Walter with a smile, "would say that spirits could find a great deal of use for a table." "I dare they say they could if the spirits were on the table, in a bottle," replied Wilson with a curl of his pale lip. "The people around here, when they're all sodden up with Irish whiskey, may believe in such things. I think they want a little education in this country." Hornfish's heavy eyelids fluttered in faint attempt to rise, if he were tempted to a lazy protest against the contemptuous tone of the investigator. "The Irish believe far and too much in spirits to believe in spiritualism," he murmured. "They know too much about 'em. If you want a simple and childlike faith in any spirit that comes along, you can get it in your favorite London." "I don't want to get it anywhere," said Wilson shortly. "I say I'm dealing with much simpler things than your simple faith, with a table and a chair and a ladder. Now what I want to say about them at the start is this. They're all three made roughly of plain wood, but the table and the chair are fairly new and comparatively clean. The ladder is covered with dust and there's a cobweb under the top rung of it. That means that he borrowed the first two quite recently from some cottage, as we suppose. But the ladder has been a long time in this rotten old dustbin. Probably was a part of the original furniture, an heirloom in this magnificent palace of the Irish kings." Again Fisher looked at him under his eyelids, but seemed too sleepy to speak, and Wilson went on with his argument. "Now it's quite clear that something very odd has just happened in this place. The chances are 10 to 1, it seems to me, that it had something especially to do with this place. Probably he came here because he could do it only here. It doesn't seem very inviting otherwise. But the man knew it of old. The set belonged to his family, so that altogether I think everything points to something in the construction of the tower itself." "Your reasoning seems to me excellent," said Sir Walter, who was listening attentively. "But what could it be?" "You see now what I mean about the ladder," went on the detective. "It's the only old piece of furniture here, and the first thing that caught that cockney eye of mine. But there is something else. That loft up there is a sort of lumber room without any lumber. As far as I can see, it's as empty as everything else, and as things are, I don't see the use of the ladder leading to it. It seems to me, as I can't find anything unusual down here, that it may pay us to look up there." He got briskly off the table on which he was sitting, for the only chair was allotted to Sir Walter, and ran rapidly up the ladder to the platform above. He was soon followed by the others, Mr. Fisher going last, however, with an appearance of considerable nonchalance. At this stage, however, they were destined to disappointment. Wilson nosed in every corner like a terrier and examined the roof almost in the posture of a fly, but half an hour afterward they had to confess that they were still without a clue. Sir Walter's private secretary seemed more and more threatened with inappropriate slumber, and having been the last to climb up the ladder, seemed now to lack the energy to even climb down again. "Come along, Fisher," called out Sir Walter from below, when the others had regained the floor. "We must consider whether we'll pull the whole place to pieces to see what it's made of." "I'm coming in a minute," said the voice from the ledge above their heads, a voice somewhat suggestive of an articulate yawn. "What are you waiting for?" asked Sir Walter impatiently. "Can you see anything there?" "Well, yes, in a way," replied the voice vaguely. "In fact, I see it quite plain now." "What is it?" asked Wilson sharply, from the table on which he sat kicking his heels restlessly. "Well, it's a man," said Horn Fisher. Wilson bounded off the table as if it had kicked off it. "What do you mean?" he cried. "How can you possibly see a man?" "I can see him through the window," replied the secretary mildly. "I see him coming across the moor. He's making a beeline across the open country towards this tower. He evidently means to pay us a visit. And considering who it seems to be, perhaps it would be more polite if we were all at the door to receive him." And in a leisurely manner, the secretary came down the ladder. "Who it seems to be?" repeated Sir Walter in astonishment. "Well, I think it's the man you call Prince Michael," observed Mr. Fisher airily. "In fact, I'm sure it is. I've seen the police portraits of him." There was a dead silence, and Sir Walter's usually steady brain seemed to go around like a sawmill. "But hang it all," he said at last, "even supposing in his own explosion could have thrown him half a mile away without passing through any of the windows, and left him alive enough for a country walk, even then why the devil would he walk in this direction? The murderer does not generally revisit the scene of his crime so rapidly as all that." "He doesn't know yet that this is the scene of his crime," answered Horn Fisher. "What on earth do you mean? You credit him with rather singular absence of mind." "Well, the truth is, it isn't the scene of his crime," said Fisher, and went and looked out of the window. There was another silence, and then Sir Walter said quietly, "What sort of notion have you really got in your head, Fisher? Have you developed a new theory about how this fellow escaped out of the ring around him?" "He never escaped at all," answered the man at the window, without turning round. "He never escaped out of the ring because he was never inside the ring. He was not in this tower at all, at least not when we were surrounding it." He turned and leaned back against the window, but in spite of his usual listless manner, they almost fancied that his face in shadow was a little pale. "I began to guess something of the sort when we were some way from the tower," he said. "Did you notice that sort of flash or flicker the candle gave before it was extinguished? I was almost certain it was only the last leap the flame gives when a candle burns itself out. And then I came into this room and I saw that." He pointed at the table, and Sir Walter caught his breath with a sort of curse at his own blindness. For the candle in the candlestick had obviously burned itself away to nothing, and left him, mentally at least, very completely in the dark. "Then there was a sort of mathematical question," went on Fisher, leaning back in his limp way and looking up at the bare walls as if tracing imaginary diagrams there. "It's not so easy for a man in the third angle to face the other two at the same moment, especially if they are at the base of an isosceles. I'm sorry if this sounds like a lecture on geometry, but—" "I'm afraid we have no time for it," said Wilson coldly. "If this man is really coming back, I must give my orders at once." "I think I'll go on with it, though," observed Fisher, staring at the roof with insolent serenity. "I must ask you, Mr. Fisher, to let me conduct my inquiry on my own lines," said Wilson firmly. "I am the officer in charge now." "Yes," remarked Horn Fisher, softly, but with an accent that somehow chilled the hearer. "Yes, but why?" Sir Walter was staring, for he had never seen his rather lackadaisical young friend look like that before. Fisher was looking at Wilson with lifted lids, and the eyes under them seemed to have shed or shifted a film, as do the eyes of an eagle. Why are you the officer in charge now? He asked. Why can you conduct the inquiry on your own lines now? How did it come about? I wonder that the elder officers are not here to interfere with anything you do. Nobody spoke, and nobody can say how soon anyone would have collected his wits to speak when a noise came from without. It was a heavy and hollow sound of a blow upon the door of the tower, and to their shaken spirits it sounded strangely like the hammer of doom. The wooden door of the tower moved on its rusty hinges under the hand that struck it, and Prince Michael came into the room. Nobody had the smallest doubt about his identity. His light clothes, though frayed with his adventures, were fine and almost foppish cut, and he wore a pointed beard, or imperial, perhaps as a further reminiscence of Louis Napoleon, but he was a much taller and more graceful man than his prototype. Before anyone could speak, he had silenced everyone for an instant, with a slight but splendid gesture of hospitality. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is a poor place now, but you are heartily welcome." Wilson was the first to recover, and he took a stride toward the newcomer. "Michael O'Neill, I arrest you in the King's name for the murder of Francis Morton and James Nolan. It is my duty to warn you." "No, no, Mr. Wilson," cried Fisher suddenly. "You shall not commit a third murder." Sir Walter Carey rose from his chair, which fell over with a crash behind him. "What does all this mean?" he called out in an authoritative manner. "It means," said Fisher, "that this man, Hooker Wilson, as soon as he had put his head in that window, killed his two comrades who had put their heads in at the other windows, by firing across the empty room. That is what it means. And if you want to know, count how many times he is supposed to have fired, and then count the charges left in his revolver." Wilson, who was still sitting on the table, abruptly put out a hand for the weapon that lay beside him. But the next movement that was the most unexpected of all, for the prince standing in the doorway passed suddenly from the dignity of a statue to the swiftness of an acrobat, and rent the revolver out of the detective's hand. "You dog," he cried. "So you are the type of English truth, as I am of Irish tragedy. You who come to kill me, wading through the blood of your brethren. If they had fallen in a feud on the hillside, it would be called murder, and your sin would be forgiven you. But I, who am innocent, I was to be slain with ceremony. There would be long speeches and patient judges listening to my vain plea of innocence, noting down my despair and disregarding it. Yes, that is what I call assassination. But killing may be no murder. There's one shot left in this little gun, and I know where it should go." Wilson turned quickly on the table, and even as he turned, he twisted in agony, for Michael shot him through the body where he sat, so that he tumbled off the table like lumber. The police rushed to lift him. Sir Walter stood speechless, and then with a strange and wary gesture, Horne Fisher spoke. "You are indeed a type of the Irish tragedy," he said. "You were entirely in the right, and you put yourself in the wrong." The prince's face was like marble for a space, and there dawned in his eyes a light not unlike that of despair. He laughed suddenly and flung the smoking pistol on the ground. "I am indeed in the wrong," he said. "I have committed a crime that may justly bring a curse on me and my children." Horne Fisher did not seem entirely satisfied with this very sudden repentance. He kept his eyes on the man and only said in a low voice, "What crime do you mean?" "I have helped English justice," replied Prince Michael. "I have avenged your king's officers. I have done the work of his hangman. For that, truly, I deserve to be hanged." And he turned to the police with a gesture that did not so much surrender to them, but rather command them to arrest him. This was the story that Horne Fisher told to Harold March, the journalist, many years after, in a little but luxurious restaurant near Piccadilly. He had invited March to dinner some time after the affair he called "The Face in the Target," and the conversation had naturally turned on that mystery and afterwards on earlier memories of Fisher's life. and the way in which he was led to study such problems as those of Prince Michael. Horn Fisher was 15 years older. His thin hair had faded to frontal baldness, and his long, thin hands dropped less with affectation and more with fatigue. And he told the story of the Irish adventure of his youth because it recorded the first occasion on which he had ever come in contact with crime, or discovered how darkly and how terribly crime can be entangled with law. Hooker Wilson was the first criminal I ever knew, and he was a policeman, explained Fisher, twirling his wine glass. And all my life has been a mixed-up business of the sort. He was a man of very real talent and perhaps genius, and well worth studying, both as a detective and a criminal. His white face and red hair were typical of him, for he was one of those who are cold and yet on fire for fame, and he could control anger but not ambition. He swallowed the snubs of his superiors in that first quarrel, though he boiled with resentment. But when he suddenly saw the two heads dark against the dawn and framed in the two windows, he could not miss the chance, not only of revenge, but of the removal of the two obstacles to his promotion. He was a dead shot and counted on silencing both. The proof against him would have been hard in any case. But as a matter of fact, he had a narrow escape in the case of Nolan, who lived just long enough to say Wilson and point. We thought he was summoning help for his comrade, but he was really denouncing his murderer. And after that, it was easy to throw down the ladder above him, for a man up a ladder cannot see clearly what is below and behind, and to throw himself on the ground as another victim of the catastrophe. But there was mixed up with his murderous ambition a real belief not only in his own talents but in his own theories. He did believe what he called a fresh eye. He did want scope for fresh methods. There was something in his view, but it failed where such things commonly fail, because the fresh eye cannot see the unseen. It is true about the ladder and the scarecrow, but not about the life and the soul. And he made a bad mistake about what a man like Michael might do when he heard a woman scream. All Michael's very vanity and vainglory made him rush out at once. He would have walked into Dublin Castle for a lady's glove. Call it his pose or what you will, but he would have done it. What happened when he met her is another story, and one we may never know. But from tales I've heard since, they must have been reconciled. Wilson was wrong there, but there was something, for all that, in his notion that the newcomer sees most, and that the man on the spot may know too much about anything. He was right about some things. He was right about me. About you? Asked Harold March in some wonder. I am the man who knows too much to know anything, or at any rate, to do anything, said Horn Fisher. I don't mean especially about Ireland. I mean about England. I mean about the whole way we are governed, and perhaps the only way we can be governed. You asked me just now what became of the survivors of that tragedy. Well, Wilson recovered, and we managed to persuade him to retire. But we had to pension that damnable murder more magnificently than any hero ever fought for England. I managed to save Michael from the worst, but we had to send that perfectly innocent man to penal servitude for a crime we know he never committed. It was only afterwards that we could connive in a sneakish way at his escape. Sir Walter Carey as Prime Minister of this country, which he would probably never have been if the truth had been told of such a horrible scandal in his department. It might have done for us all together in Ireland. It would certainly have done for him. And he's my father's old friend, and he's always smothered me with kindness. I'm too tangled up with the whole thing, you see, and I was certainly never born to set it right. He looked distressed, not to say shocked. I'm not at all offended at it. Let us change the subject by all means, if you like. What do you think of this Burgundy? It's rather a discovery of mine, like the restaurant itself. And he proceeded to talk learnedly and luxuriantly on all the wines of the world, on which subject also some moralists would consider that he knew too much. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepytime Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Sweet Night and Friends by Kumiku. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in their show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.